In a world where the rules have changed, an era of universal class change has begun, and otherworldly dungeons are randomly opening all over the planet. Countless people chose martial professions, risked their lives, cleared dungeons, and fought alien monsters. Thus humanity gradually evolved, and soon everything came to the emergence of the so-called new people. However, our main character, Martin, had a hard time surviving in this new reality. His cousin mockingly stated that the hero had already been expelled from the family, but still somehow hoped to fix something by changing his class. He looked down at Martin and remarked contemptuously that he would be better off spending the rest of his life at the very bottom. But Martin still held on. He promised to pay for every humiliation and to do it many times over. But his cousin Carl only laughed. For him, Martin was just a pathetic joke. The boy then raised his leg, preparing to deliver the finishing blow, and mockingly remarked that the hero should continue dreaming in the next life. However, the priestess suddenly stepped forward, her appearance instantly silencing everyone. The girl reminded that this is a temple of class change, and no one is allowed to cause trouble here. Carl snorted in displeasure, but still retreated. As he left, he stated that Martin was simply lucky. The priestess saved his life. Meanwhile, the girl turned to Martin and extended her hand, asking if he was okay. The protagonist accepted the help and stood up. Meanwhile, more and more young men and women came to the temple, and soon the room was overcrowded. Finally, the ceremony officially began. Someone loudly ordered everyone to line up. One by one, the participants underwent awakening, and results appeared on the sphere. For example, someone received the D-rank soldier class. Martin understood perfectly well that a person's value was directly determined by his class. The higher the rarity, the greater the potential. Soon, his cousin Carl stepped forward, and when the young man touched the awakening sphere, he obtained the rare B-rank class, Novice Hero. The crowd immediately erupted in whispers and surprise. Getting a B rank already at the first awakening was considered a huge success. The guy himself turned to Martin and sarcastically remarked that the hero would be lucky if he at least woke up as a D-rank farmer. The protagonist didn't react at all. He understood that if he ever wanted to take revenge, he had to get a combat class at any cost. Finally, the young man approached the sphere and placed his hand on it. At that moment, something strange happened. The sphere suddenly began to tremble, and bursts of energy began to spread throughout the crystal, as if a huge force was awakening within. Martin's eyes widened. He immediately felt that something was wrong. A dark blue energy began to flow out of the sphere. The laughter around gradually died down. A wave of cold rolled through the hall. But the guys still continued to make fun of the hero. The next moment, a dark vortex of energy burst out of Martin's body and filled the entire hall. The hero was lifted into the air, enveloped in a blinding blue light that pulsed with terrifying power. And then, a message appeared in front of everyone that the awakening of a special SSS rank class, Dark Summoner, had taken place. Then Martin slowly sank to the ground. His appearance completely changed. Suddenly, a huge ghostly image of the goddess appeared behind the hero. People were talking to each other, not believing their own eyes. Everything that was happening seemed somehow incredible to them. Under the pressure of this force, the awakening sphere could not withstand it and shattered into pieces. And then the abbot of the temple screamed in confusion. The hall instantly descended into chaos, many wondering how an SSS rank class was even possible if S rank was considered the highest level. However, the master turned to Martin. He congratulated him on awakening the hidden class, but then added that the cost of summoning was too high. He estimates that the hero's actual combat power could be at the D rank level, and that summoner classes require financial investment. Hearing this, Carl immediately chuckled and declared that the hero had awakened a trash class after all, and SSS-ranked trash was perfect for Martin. The guy then suggested sparring so everyone could see how great this new class was. The priestess tried to intervene and remarked that this was mockery, but the elder abruptly cut her off, declaring that this was the Yang family's business. Meanwhile, Martin raised his head. He calmly agreed and said that since his cousin insisted so much, then they could have a training fight. In response, Carl laughed loudly and pulled out his sword. He then coldly stated that blades had no eyes, and then rushed forward with the intent to kill. But at that very second, a bony skeletal hand suddenly burst out of the ground. Carl stopped right in the middle of the attack. His face turned pale with horror, and he asked in panic what it was. Suddenly, a giant ghost with eyes glowing with an evil light appeared in front of him. Seeing this, Carl screamed in fear. Martin only quietly said that he didn't even understand what kind of talent he had awakened, after which Martin confidently waved his hand. Blue flames erupted around him, and from the vortex of energy, the figure of the goddess of death, Dark Night, began to descend. Carl looked at the emerging figure with horror, his voice trembling as he screamed that it was impossible. He screamed hysterically that the hero was just trash and could not summon such a creature. Martin had neither talent nor ability. A cold smile appeared on the goddess's lips. Her scarlet eye flashed, and she quietly said that there was too much unnecessary chatter around. The effect worked instantly. Carl's eyes suddenly bulged, and the blood vessels in them burst, turning them bloody. Blood gushed from his mouth, and his body convulsed as his internal organs were destroyed. In an instant, the once arrogant Carl collapsed to the floor, lifeless. The crowd froze in horror, and then a whisper rolled through the hall. People spoke with disbelief about the fact that the young master was killed instantly. The elders stated that the hero dared to kill a man in the Temple of Class Change, but Martin replied that it was a fair fight between them. However, the elder was not going to listen to the explanation. A blinding solar energy began to swirl around him. The man stated that if a member of the Yang family died here, he would not be able to answer to this family, so he was going to execute the culprit. The protagonist didn't even flinch. A dark vortex of energy swirled in front of him. But before the blow could reach its target, Dark Night stepped forward, its darkness colliding with the elder's shining light. After this, the goddess narrowed her eyes slightly and quietly asked Martin if she could kill this man too. However, the hero replied that it was too early to enter into open conflict, so it was enough to simply teach the enemy a lesson. Dark Night bowed her head slightly, accepting the order. Then a dark purple energy began to gather in her palm. At that moment, a skeleton warrior burst out of the shadows and instantly rushed at the elder, brandishing his blades. Martin calmly noted that the statement about Carl's death was not entirely accurate. It turned out that he had a passive skill for the warrior class, False Death. This effect allowed him to survive fatal damage once. But even in this state, he continued to threaten Martin, declaring that he was trash and would not dare to kill him. He also threatened that if the hero touched him, all the elders of the Yang family would persecute Martin until his death. However, Martin raised his leg and looked with disdain at Carl, who was trying to crawl away across the floor. In a calm voice, he said that in that case, let the elders come, after which his leg dropped sharply. The blow split the stone floor, and Carl's life finally died out, for which the hero received 1,200 experience points and reached level 2. After some time, Carl's body lay in the coffin, surrounded by the elders of the Yang family. One of the elders said bitterly that the same trash who was kicked out of the family actually dared to kill Carl. The old man hit the coffin with his fist and shouted angrily that something like this could not be forgiven. But even then, the man was not going to give up. After this, the elder said that he had already paid a huge sum to hire the high priest of the temple and perform the resurrection ritual. Then he turned to the man standing next to him in long robes, a man, and asked him to begin the ritual. The high priest looked at him calmly and remarked that it was a trivial matter. After this, the ritual began. The man declared that he was able to resurrect any person who had died within the last 24 hours. But suddenly his eyes widened. Something was wrong. At that moment, Martin appeared in front of him. He said that he knew in advance about the attempt to resurrect Carl, so he left a small backup plan. At that moment, a purple light burst out of the coffin. The hero said that this was the corpse explosion technique and suggested considering it a small gift. At that moment, the elder's face was distorted with horror. Suddenly, a powerful explosion was heard in the hall. A wave of dark energy tore through the hall, and the coffin disappeared in a blinding flash of purple light. Among the rubble, one of the elders struggled to his feet, realizing that he had lost everything. The man then demanded that Martin be immediately declared wanted, and that a reward of 10 million gold coins be offered. Meanwhile, elsewhere was the Cave of Trials, one of the earliest dungeons to appear in this world. The monsters inside were relatively weak, so this place was considered an ideal training area for beginners. Inside the cave, the squad fought a boss. It was a level 15 Minotaur. Its health was still full. Every step he took made the ground shake, so the group had to constantly retreat, trying to find a good moment to attack. Meanwhile, Martin watched the proceedings with obvious boredom, quietly noting that the monsters in this dungeon were too weak. One of the group members noticed him and said that this useless guy was of no help at all and wondered why he had come here. Another adventurer suggested that Martin simply wanted to collect the dropped loot, adding that he could be dealt with later. Despite the tension, the fight was drawing to a close, the Minotaur letting out a final heavy roar as his health dropped to 0. After this, the huge body of the monster fell to the ground with a roar. The cave instantly filled with joyful cries, and the novice hunters announced with relief that the dungeon was finally cleared. However, almost immediately the situation changed dramatically. The ground underfoot began to pulsate strangely. Suddenly the cave shook violently, stones fell from the ceiling, and then a rotating portal opened up right out of the ground. A huge, glowing red magic circle quickly spread across the floor and trapped the entire group inside. Meanwhile, Martin was calmly watching what was happening from the shadows, and suddenly a deafening roar swept through the cave. A huge monster, a chimera, burst out from the center of the magic circle. The newcomers fell silent in shock, and someone quietly and fearfully asked what kind of creature it was. Then one of the warriors explained that they were facing a legendary secret boss, a chimera, whose chance of appearing was only 1 in 10,000. However, at that moment the main character noticed that an interesting opponent had finally appeared. While the terrified newcomers hid behind him, Martin stepped forward, blue energy flaring around his body. The next moment, a huge wave of flame from the chimera's mouth rolled through the cave, destroying everything in its path. One of the adventurers was unlucky, and the flames simply burned him alive before the eyes of his astonished comrades. The hunters scattered in panic, but amidst the chaos, Martin stood his ground right in front of the monster. The remaining fighters began to retreat in despair. They understood perfectly well that their strength was incomparable with the strength of the monster. Then the chimera roared again, his eyes landing on the only person who wasn't about to run. But the hero didn't even flinch. Instead, the young man calmly raised his hand and quietly spoke the command, calling for the Dark Knight to descend. A huge magic circle flared up beneath his feet, illuminating the dungeon with light. From the swirling shadows emerged Dark Knight, goddess of death, declaring that she had come at her master's call. Her gaze immediately moved to the giant chimera, and she declared that she would become an opponent for this kitten. After that, the Dark Knight spoke one word, an order to disappear. The dark energy instantly compressed into a rotating vortex that engulfed the chimera and blocked all its escape routes. With a blinding blow, the goddess literally tore the chimera lord apart. Everything happened in an instant. The creature that had paralyzed an entire squad a few seconds ago now lay lifeless and crumbled. Martin stood motionless. System notifications appeared before his eyes one after another. He had gained a new level. The system then reported receiving an item, a legendary chimera, and several more messages followed. New skills were unlocked for the hero, Dark Element Sphere and Necro Enhancement, and Martin's strength grew rapidly. Meanwhile, the surviving hunters were hiding behind the broken rocks, trembling and looking at the hero with complete distrust. When the death of the chimera was finally confirmed, an exit portal opened in the cave. Without saying a word, the hunters hurried toward the light, hoping to get away as quickly as possible before Martin noticed them. They wanted only one thing, to be as far away from this man as possible. But the hero heard everything perfectly well. He called out to them in a calm voice, and these words had the effect of a blow on the people. They stopped instantly. Martin turned slowly towards them with a grim smile, and remarked that they should not be in such a hurry to leave. The goddess did not tolerate disrespect, so she calmly reminded Martin of the insults that these people had thrown at him earlier. With a cruel smile, she asked if she should kill them. However, Martin stopped the goddess. He explained that this was not necessary, because these people had done no evil. One of the huntress girls suddenly fell to her knees and bowed low, admitting that they had been blind and disrespectful. She then thanked the hero for sparing their lives. Martin watched her silently for a moment, then a dark, predatory smile appeared on his face. He noted that mercy does not come free, and if they really want to leave alive, they must show sincerity. At that moment, the girl realized that this sincerity would cost them much more than they had expected. In the end, Martin literally robbed them. He left the dungeon with thousands of coins and potions, leaving the hunters standing in their underwear. The hero also realized that his new skill, Dark Element Sphere, was terrifyingly powerful, but required a huge expenditure of stamina and mana. However, thanks to his passive skill, which significantly reduced energy consumption, this problem was no longer a serious one. After leaving the dungeon, the young man changed his appearance and headed to the shopping district. Martin stopped in front of the gun shop and spent some time looking at the samples displayed behind glass. Finally, he decided that it was time to upgrade his equipment, after which he calmly walked inside and was met by the owner of the shop. However, the hero ignored him and immediately headed towards the weapons hanging along the walls. He picked up one of the blades and began to examine it carefully, while the shopkeeper followed behind. When his gaze slid over Martin's simple clothes, the man decided that he was looking at an ordinary poor guy who was wasting his time. The merchant's irritation gradually increased while the protagonist continued to calmly examine the weapon. Martin then stopped in front of a staff called the Scepter of Hades and asked about its price. The merchant announced that the buyer was looking at a real treasure, and that this item was worth 2 million gold coins. Suddenly, a bright purple aura flared around Martin's hand, and he asked how much such an item might cost. At that moment, the shopkeeper literally froze in shock. He stuttered as he said that it was a legendary material that could fetch at least 2.5 million gold coins at auction. The man then asked, completely perplexed, how a man like Martin could own such an item. Then the merchant bowed and began to apologize hastily, admitting that this material was much more valuable than anything else he had in his shop. He quickly asked the hero to wait a bit and hastily disappeared into the back room. Meanwhile, the shopkeeper leaned towards his assistant and quietly said that this was the very man, the target that the Yang family was looking for. The man then ordered the assistant to contact them immediately, adding that he himself would remain in the store to detain the guest. Soon Martin asked how much longer he would have to wait. The shopkeeper replied that everything was almost ready and asked him to wait a little longer. At that moment, Martin's gaze instantly became colder, and he asked why the man was so nervous. And suddenly the next moment, a huge two-handed sword crashed into the floor right next to Martin. A group of knights entered the shop, and their leader announced that the elite forces of the Class Change Temple were in front of Martin. He then claimed that the Yang family had hired them to kill the hero. In response, Martin released his aura, Dark Knight appeared behind him, and the store was filled with blue flames. The hero noticed that the Class Change Temple seemed to be in collusion with the Yang family, adding that the whole thing looked more like a nest of rats. The goddess noticed that some small knight dared to show disrespect to her master, after which she summoned the skeleton warriors. They instantly rose and rushed forward, and soon surrounded the fair-haired knight. However, the squad leader only narrowed his eyes slightly and remained completely unperturbed. With a furious swing of his sword, he activated his technique, golden energy bursting out, cutting through the skeletons. Bones and blue flames instantly scattered across the floor. Then the man laughed and stated that their squad specialized in destroying the undead and demons. After that, his gaze suddenly stopped on the goddess. The man suggested that the hero killed Carl precisely with the help of the Dark Knight, namely, through eye contact. The knight then proudly announced that all A-rank Grey Knights were equipped with high-level equipment, the Sacred Heart. After this, the man smugly added that even killing a level 60 boss was no problem for them. He then rushed at Martin and declared that his main support as a hero was now useless, so all he could do was calmly accept death. However, Martin did not even budge from his spot and replied that it was not he who should die but the knights. At that moment, the Dark Knight behind him closed its eyes, and divine power began to rapidly gather around it. The blonde knight rushed forward, laughing mockingly and declaring that they were immune to instant death. And suddenly, a giant eye surrounded by heavenly lightning opened in the sky. It was the true power of an SSS-rank deity, the Death Gaze. Under the gaze of the god, the Sacred Heart was split into pieces, and then the knight's self-confidence instantly gave way to horror. The goddess's power threw him back, and blood gushed from his mouth. The man fell hard onto the stone floor, while Martin and Dark Knight watched from the sidelines. The knight muttered in despair that this was impossible, since he was using equipment that gave immunity to instant death. Martin approached him and said that in front of him was equipment of a rare rank. At the same time, he added mockingly that the knight was wrong to think that such equipment could withstand the gaze of a god. Seeing their leader lying completely motionless on the ground, one of the knights screamed in panic that their leader was killed. However, Martin did not give them even a second to mourn the deceased. The hero began to gather mana in his palm. The hero declared that he no longer needed the Dark Knight, because he himself was capable of dealing with all his opponents. With these words, Martin released the spell, and a huge column of dark blue energy burst from his palm. Meanwhile, the surviving knights and priests hastily formed a defensive line. one of the priests shouted a spell of holy protection. Immediately after this, a huge golden barrier appeared in front of them, and everyone present began to pour the rest of their energy into it. The knight shouted that this man's skills required an insane amount of mana, so his energy reserves were probably almost depleted. The next moment, the shadow wasteland struck the holy light shield with a roar. The priest shouted that they needed to endure the attack first, and then counterattack and kill the enemy when his stamina ran out. Hearing this, Martin just laughed. For him, it was all just beginning, because his mana reserves were much greater than they could have imagined. At that moment, columns of blue energy began to burst out of the floor, surrounding Martin. The attack was so massive that it completely eclipsed their golden shield. The priest's eyes widened in horror as cracks began to rapidly spread across the shield of holy light. The next second, the golden barrier shattered, and the knight shouted that they had to run because it was impossible to defeat this man. However, it was already too late, as a moment later a powerful explosion rocked the hall. When it was all over, the knights lay lifeless all over the floor. Martin stood at the very center of the destruction. At that moment, the system reported an increase to level 22, and the hero also unlocked a new skill. The shop owner realized in horror that before him was a monster that had destroyed an entire elite order of knights in just one instant. Realizing that he was the only one left alive, the man quickly jumped to his feet, realizing that he needed to run and save himself. He rushed towards the exit, but before he could take a single step, the hero asked him where he was going to go, since they hadn't paid yet. The shop owner's legs immediately gave way. He fell to his knees and began desperately begging for mercy. With trembling hands, the merchant extended the staff and asked to accept this item for free, if only his life would be spared. It turns out that the Scepter of Hades is epic rank, increases attack, mana, and defense, and also significantly increases dark energy damage. The hero noted that the item turned out to be quite good, but this was not enough for him to let the shopkeeper go. The man then said that he had previously studied this scepter and found out that it was part of Hades's set. According to legend, whoever collects the complete set of Hades will gain true power, allowing them to control life and death itself. The shopkeeper begged to let him go, explaining that he had told everything he knew. He screamed in panic that he no longer even wanted the materials he had bought from the hero and was ready to return every last detail. However, the protagonist needed guarantees. The Dark Knight helped him and bound the shopkeeper with an oath of the river Styx. At that moment, waves passed through the air. Dark waters began to rise straight from the floor, slowly wrapping around the shopkeeper's legs. At that moment, bony hands suddenly burst out of the dark water and began to grab the shop owner, gradually dragging him deeper and deeper. The hero noted that he had no intention of killing him, but demanded that he swear before the river Styx that he would not tell anyone about his battle with the knights. The very frightened shopkeeper immediately nodded furiously and promised that he would not tell anyone about what had happened. After this, the Dark Knight completed the ritual, and the goddess declared that the oath on the river Styx was established. She warned that any violator would be dragged to the bottom of this river forever. Then the ghostly waves disappeared, and Martin headed towards the exit, briefly noting that this was where their paths diverged. Left alone in the quiet shop, the owner muttered through his teeth that this time he had really lost big. However, he convinced himself that everything that had happened was just a bluff, and thought that the story with the river Styx was just a deception. Meanwhile, the story moves to the luxurious estate of the Yang family. Suddenly, a heavy fist struck the wooden table, and a loud crack echoed throughout the hall. The second young master of the Yang family, Evan, heard his subordinate's report and exclaimed incredulously. He was informed that the 12th detachment of knights had been completely destroyed. Then Evan demanded to know how this had even happened, since we were talking about the elite forces of the Class Change Temple. The subordinate reported that they all died inside the gun shop, after which he added that the owner of the shop had already been brought in. Soon he entered the hall, bowed low and laughed nervously, greeting the young master. However, Evan immediately demanded to know everything and promised a reward for information on how Martin managed to destroy the squad of knights. Upon hearing of the reward, the shop owner instantly perked up, and eventually his greed completely overshadowed his oath. Then the man began to recount in detail what had happened, and was about to tell how Martin had summoned something during the fight. However, at that very moment, the floor beneath his feet distorted, turning into a dark whirlpool. Evan watched in horror as a terrifying force erupted in the very center of his mansion. Then a huge whirlwind of black water opened up in the middle of the room, and the shop owner screamed in pain as the waves engulfed his body. At that very moment, bony hands burst out of the whirlpool and grabbed him by the boots, gradually pulling him down. The man desperately reached forward, begging for salvation, but no one could help him. Almost swallowed up by the water, he desperately tried to justify himself, claiming that he had not meant to break his oath at all. However, Martin calmly stated that any oath-breaker would inevitably be dragged to the bottom of the river, a fate he had brought upon himself. Suddenly, a spatial rift, similar to a portal, opened nearby, from which countless skeletons began to emerge. The moment Evan saw these creatures, his expression changed, and one by one, the skeletons slowly moved towards him. Then the man quickly looked around and noticed a bow and arrows behind him. He quickly grabbed the weapon. Evan thought with irritation that he had absolutely no idea where these creatures came from, or how Martin had managed to send them here. After this, Evan began to shoot arrows at the approaching skeletons. However, there were too many enemies, so it became increasingly difficult to hold them back. At that moment, a powerful spell suddenly descended from the sky and completely destroyed the skeletons in an instant. It turned out that Evan's savior was a girl who unexpectedly appeared nearby. The stranger reproachfully noted that Evan was pathetic, since he couldn't cope with a bunch of dead people. Then the girl explained that in front of them were only the temporarily opened gates of the river Styx, which would soon close. And indeed, immediately after her words, the whirlpool began to quickly disappear. Then Evan looked at the disappearing portal for a while, after which he finally breathed a sigh of relief. Then he put his hand on the girl's shoulder and suggested that she think about marrying him, as she was truly worthy of such a union. However, the girl immediately threw off his hand. She reminded that although the class change temple cooperated with the Yang family, that did not mean it was allowed to act so arrogantly. Evan then declared that after he killed Martin, who had ruined their reputation, the temple elders would support their marriage. Meanwhile, the action moves to another place, to the Desert of Death, an area with an extremely high level of danger. This desert was inhabited by a huge number of demonic beasts, so only a few adventurers dared to enter it. It was here that the level 65 monster, the god of death Anubis, lived, and at that moment, the ruler was furious because someone dared to disturb his peace. In front of him stood the Dark Knight, behind which were countless skeletons. Immediately after this, Anubis summoned his own army of kobolds, and the monsters immediately rushed into battle against the skeleton army. Martin noted that, as expected, Hades' equipment power is indeed impressive, but the quality of his soldiers is superior. After this, Martin activated his skill, enhanced by Necro Control, due to which the power of his skeletons increased even more. As a result, the skeletons completely suppressed the kobolds, and soon the entire army of monsters was completely exterminated. Seeing this, Anubis became completely enraged. His army was destroyed too easily. However, he warned his opponent not to become arrogant. Then he summoned a magic staff into his palm, after which the god of death declared that he would now fight seriously. First, Anubis took out the divine scales, placed the protagonist's heart on one scale and a feather on the other. At that very moment, an unbearable pain flared up inside Martin's chest, as if something was squeezing his heart. Then the hero dropped to one knee and grabbed his chest. Anubis declared that the enemy's heart was now under his control. If the scales tip even a little, it will mean that his sins are heavier than a feather, and then the punishment will be death. And when this happened, Anubis immediately sentenced Martin to death. However, suddenly there was a powerful explosion, and the hero screamed, clutching his chest. However, the next moment he rose to his feet. The pain disappeared and a mocking smile appeared on Martin's face. Then the young man said that he was just joking. At that moment, Anubis froze for a moment in shock. Martin then stated that he is the true master of darkness and death, so instant death cannot affect him. Hearing this, Anubis exclaimed that this was impossible, since the person in front of him was only a man. However, deep down he was already beginning to feel fear, because the hero's dark aura seemed completely inhuman. Without giving the enemy time to think, the protagonist ordered the goddess to end the fight. Receiving the master's order, Dark Knight stepped forward and began to gather dark power in her palm. When Anubis realized that his death was inevitable, he experienced true horror, but there was no time left for salvation. The next moment, Dark Knight released an attack. She formed a black hole-like vortex that instantly swallowed the death god. Anubis screamed as his body began to disintegrate and soon turned to ash. When he died, his necklace fell to the ground, and the hero received 64,000 experience points, and his level rose to 35. Martin then picked up the fallen item, which turned out to be Hades' pendant. Its characteristics turned out to be incredible. It also provided immunity to various negative conditions. Martin kept the necklace for himself and prepared to leave, noting that he now held the second piece of Hades' equipment in his hands. However, suddenly a voice was heard from behind, asking him to stop. When the hero turned around, he unexpectedly saw Anubis. Then the god of death acknowledged that the enemy's strength had exceeded his expectations, and announced that he had decided to acknowledge his power. After this, Anubis stepped forward and knelt down, declaring that if the hero deemed him worthy, then he was ready to serve him. Seeing this, Dark Knight was completely shocked. Having received Anubis, Martin sealed him inside the necklace and was extremely pleased with the result. The hero didn't expect such rich loot. He not only received a huge amount of experience and an epic item, but also acquired a powerful trump card. After this, the young man opened a black portal and left the dungeon. The hero thought that he still needed to collect 3 other pieces of equipment. Only then would he be able to confront the Yang family. However, suddenly 2 arrows shot at him from above. The arrow hit its target and immediately there was a powerful explosion. The ones who set up the ambush turned out to be Evan and Patricia. The man smugly declared that he had finally managed to ambush the main character. However, the girl, Patricia, coldly remarked that it was too early to celebrate, since first they needed to make sure that the enemy was really dead. Then Evan turned his gaze to the clouds of smoke. The next second the main character emerged from the smoke, completely unharmed. The hero coldly noted that Evan was hiding in the shadows and shooting from behind, after which he contemptuously called him trash. Immediately after, Dark Knight appeared next to him, noticing that the Yang family was showing unexpected generosity by sending her new prey. Upon seeing the goddess, Evan froze, and the thought immediately occurred to him that a legendary divine being was standing before him. However, Patricia, on the contrary, remained dead. The girl took out a special item, a celestial stone. She was sure that they also had their own trump card prepared, namely the summoning of cherubim. She then activated the stone, and cherubim instantly appeared behind her, and Patricia proudly declared that she had 3 heavenly stones. She also noted that cherubim is a high-ranking archangel whose combat power is comparable to God's and even exceeds level 70. Seeing the summoned creature, Martin looked at the goddess and asked if the girl could defeat him without using instant death. In response, Dark Knight noted that the fight would be a bit troublesome, but this opponent was still no match for her. After that, she stepped forward and confidently declared that she would finish the battle within 3 minutes. Immediately after this, the Dark Knight rushed towards the Archangel, starting the battle. Meanwhile, Evan pulled the bowstring again and aimed the arrow at the main character. He was sure that now no one could protect him. Then he called Patricia to help him kill this bastard. The girl immediately moved and took up a position on the other side to surround the main character. Suddenly, a glowing circle appeared under Martin's feet, and he declared that his opponents had decided too soon that he had only one god. After these words, he summoned a new servant, the god of death Anubis. Immediately after this, the figure of Anubis began to slowly rise from the summoning circle, his body enveloped in powerful dark energy. Now there was another god standing in front of Evan, and upon seeing this, he was completely stunned. He could not accept what was happening and in despair declared that this simply could not be. Then Evan fired an arrow straight at Anubis. The arrow quickly cut through the air and flew towards its target. However, the moment she reached the god of death, a sharp metallic sound was heard. The projectile collided with an invisible barrier and instantly shattered, revealing that there was a transparent protective shield around Anubis. The god then turned respectfully to Martin and noted that after becoming his summoned being, his power had increased significantly. However, Martin cut him off and ordered him to stop flattering him, after which the hero gave the order to kill Evan. Meanwhile, Anubis bowed respectfully and raised his divine scales. This time the trial was supposed to concern Evan himself. The moment the scales appeared, the man clutched his chest, his heart pierced by unbearable pain. Anubis announced that Evan's soul would be weighed, noting that he had spent his life bullying the weak and committing many atrocities. As a result, the scales with the heart dropped sharply, and then the god of death declared that for such a person, there was only one outcome: death. The next moment, Evan's heart exploded right in his chest. Blood suddenly gushed from the man's mouth. Patricia watched this without the slightest emotion. Evan's death meant absolutely nothing to her. Already on his deathbed, Evan still couldn't believe that his life would end this way. However, at that moment, life completely left him. Then the main character approached Patricia and noticed that Evan was dead, but her face remained absolutely calm. The girl replied indifferently that he was just a weakling, so his death did not evoke any feelings in her. After this, Patricia took out her staff. The girl confidently stated that the battle should have already ended by this point. Patricia added that the false god that Martin had summoned would not be able to resist cherubim. She was confident of the archangel's victory. However, the very next second a powerful explosion was heard in the distance, and Patricia's expression changed dramatically. When she looked towards the source of the sound, she saw the goddess standing calmly on the body of the fallen archangel. Dark Knight indifferently noted that the enemy turned out to be even weaker than she expected. At that moment, the protagonist appeared behind Patricia with a slight smile, and reminded her of her previous words. The girl was shocked. Her second-rank archangel had already been defeated. She watched as Cherubim's enormous body gradually disintegrated into particles of light and disappeared completely. Meanwhile, the protagonist looked at her calmly and asked if she really still intended to be his enemy. Then he offered her one chance. She had to give in. At that moment, Patricia realized that she was facing a real monster that could not be defeated. Therefore, the girl decided to pretend to be submissive and later try to escape. She then declared that she was ready to surrender, while preparing to carry out her secret plan. However, Dark Knight did not trust Patricia and suggested resolving the issue differently, but Martin calmly replied that she should not rush. Then he raised his hand and began to gather dark energy. The next second, countless bony hands burst out of the ground. After this, Martin looked at Patricia and stated that he was not going to trust her so easily. But there was one way to prove loyalty. Then the hero demanded that Patricia swear before the river Styx that she would fully accept him as her master and become his faithful servant. Patricia tried to object and noted that he was going too far since she was a priestess of the Class Change Temple. Her voice trembled noticeably, for she understood perfectly well that the Oath of Styx left no way back. When Martin heard this, his gaze suddenly turned cold. Then he calmly noted that if she was not happy with something, he could send her to the river Styx right now. And then suddenly the staff fell out of the girl's hand and hit the ground. After this, Patricia fell to her knees. Now she finally understood that there was no way out. Finally, Patricia declared that she, the saint of the Temple of Class Change, swears before the river Styx to serve Martin and keep him eternally faithful. At that moment, the oath was completed, and control over her fate passed entirely to the protagonist. However, Evan's spirit soon appeared before them. Seeing what was happening, Evan's spirit began to scream furiously and shower Patricia with curses, demanding that she avenge him. Then the hero declared that it was precisely for this reason that he had saved his soul, so that he could witness his defeat, and then the spirit's face distorted with rage. However, his scream was cut off as his soul was pulled away by an invisible force and disappeared into the abyss. Martin indifferently noted that he was no longer useful now, since his fate had already been decided. After this, the hero's gaze turned again to Patricia. The girl was still kneeling, pressing her forehead to the ground. Then Martin approached her and thought about how exactly he should proceed next. Meanwhile, Patricia was imagining the worst possible things he could do to her. But suddenly her thoughts were interrupted. The protagonist looked at her and reminded her that she had already taken an oath on the river Styx, so there was no reason to be so nervous. Hearing this, Patricia immediately lowered her gaze, and a slight blush appeared on her cheeks. Meanwhile, Martin asked why the Temple of Class Change had been working so closely with the Yang family recently. Patricia answered honestly that the reason was related to the hero's older brother Sean, who was about to go through his third shift of the class. Hearing this, the protagonist finally showed real interest and asked when exactly Sean was going to change classes. Patricia hesitated for a moment before answering. Meanwhile, the story moved to the western branch of the Temple of Class Change. The entire building was fortified with a powerful protective barrier. A gray-haired old man stood in the center of the hall and announced that today was a significant day for the Temple of Class Change. Next to him was Sean, a level 60 warrior, a dual Class A rank holder, and a Holy Light Paladin. The young gentleman listened to the guests' whispers with a smug smile. Some have noted that the Emperor Paladin class is legendary and nearly invincible among fighters of the same level. Hearing these words, Sean only smiled wider. Suddenly, the president of the Seven-Star Chamber of Commerce, Rose, remarked that it was rather risky to hold such an important ceremony so publicly. She stated that the Yang family had accumulated many enemies, and just recently a wanted criminal had appeared. However, Sean stated that she was worrying too much, since in the Western branch, every brick was reinforced with divine arts. For this reason, no one dares to come here, and if they do, they will find only death. However, at that very moment, a powerful explosion was heard above the barrier. The entire building shook and the guests staggered as an icy chill spread through the hall. Rose looked up and felt something chill her to the bone. Then a second explosion thundered, and black smoke began to spread across the ceiling. The old man's face immediately darkened. He felt a familiar aura and realized that it was the energy of the undead. The next moment, the black fog parted, and the main character calmly emerged through it. Then Martin looked straight at Sean and declared that today was an important day for him to change classes. That was why he, his younger brother, personally came to congratulate him, his voice filled with caustic mockery. The old man and Sean were shocked, but their real shock was not only the appearance of the hero. Patricia stood behind him, the girl obediently silent and clearly embarrassed by her new image. Seeing this, the old man's face distorted with rage. He angrily demanded to know what exactly the protagonist had done to their saint. Meanwhile, Sean clenched his fists in anger and his eyes flashed with rage. However, Martin pulled Patricia towards him by the chin and said that she was no longer a saint, but his lover. The girl looked awkwardly at everyone present and confirmed that this was indeed the case. At that moment, everyone in the room froze in bewilderment and did not know what to answer. Then Rose, looking at Martin, assumed that this was the same traitor of the Yang clan who had caused all this commotion. People could not believe that he dared to treat a saint from the temple in such a way, and decided that by doing so, he had signed his own death warrant. Immediately after this, the guard priests arrived in the hall. Their leader ordered the immediate killing of this scoundrel who had disturbed the peace in the temple. At that moment, the eyes of the skeletons that Martin had summoned flashed with an unkind glint. Before the priests had time to come to their senses, the skeletal warriors immediately pounced on them and killed their leader in an instant. Sean immediately reached for his weapon, intending to kill Martin for daring to destroy his barrier and cause chaos here. However, the elder stopped him, saying that Sean's promotion to another class was more important, and that he himself would detain Martin. The hero then addressed everyone present, and declared that he was only targeting Sean and the Temple of Awakening. He asked the others to simply stand back and watch, promising not to harm innocent people. But the old man was not going to give up, although he admitted that Martin had succeeded in capturing St. Patricia. Even though he knew his strength was weaker, the old man was still going to put his life on the line. So he used the Great Seal, an 8th-level divine art, and sealed Martin into a cage. The hero looked around in bewilderment, not understanding where this man had placed him. As it turned out, the old man tried to seal Martin. The others present noted that this Great Seal was once used to trap a god-tier boss. The old man himself said that this seal was connected to his life force and was strengthened by hundreds of high-level divine arts of the temple. He stated that breaking this seal would be as difficult as destroying an entire continent. However, to everyone's horror, the next moment the seal simply exploded before everyone's eyes. The main character emerged from there, completely safe and sound. The old man immediately fell to his knees and coughed up blood, completely unable to understand how Martin had been able to break his seal. The hero only approached him indifferently and asked him to repeat his words about the impossibility of breaking this seal. Martin said with a grin that he didn't quite understand what the old man was saying. In response, the man only looked at him angrily, not wanting to give in to the young man's provocations. At that moment, an explosion occurred behind Martin, and a huge column of fire descended into the temple, attracting everyone's attention. As it turned out, it was Sean, who during this time managed to successfully advance to the SS class, Holy Emperor Paladin. The next moment, Sean stretched out his arms, and divine wings immediately grew behind his back. Now, in front of the main character was a level 60 Holy Emperor Paladin. He looked at his opponent with contempt, realizing that he was no longer his equal. Rose froze with horror on her face, and everyone around her realized that Sean was indeed blessed, as the rumors said. Rose understood that high-level class advancement was very difficult, with a success rate of less than 1%. At that moment, Sean drew his sword and walked forward. Everyone around held their breath, watching as he got closer and closer to Martin. But the hero did not attack him. Instead, he even began to applaud his older brother. He calmly congratulated him on his successful promotion up the class, because Martin himself did not expect that he would succeed. However, Sean didn't answer him, and instead simply walked past him. He then approached the old man, his teacher, and apologized for the fact that it had taken him so long, and he had ended up being late. However, the old man hastened to assure him that he was fine. He was still breathing, which meant the guy was not too late. He then looked furiously at the protagonist and stated that they needed to take care of him first. However, Martin immediately sent his skeletons to attack, declaring that they would still see who would take care of whom. Sean didn't hesitate, and in that very moment he cut down the undead warriors with his sword. He stated that the mere undead were not worth his time fighting at all. When Martin realized that his brother had an S-class combat skill, Imperial Might Mastery, he even became a little tense. The others were delighted, as expected, after Sean appeared. The unpleasant cold immediately disappeared. Now their bodies were filled with energy. Sean then pointed his sword at the protagonist and ordered him to summon his deity. He stated that in that case, they would have a completely fair fight. Martin only told him with a smile not to blame him for what he had asked for. After this, the hero waved his hand and summoned his subordinate goddess, Dark Knight. The girl immediately appeared at the call of her master and looked around at everyone with a smile. However, Sean was immune to all negative effects, and therefore stated that Martin should rely only on pure strength. But suddenly he dropped sharply to one knee, and a clot of blood flew out of his mouth. The hero chuckled, saying that Sean was acting so confident, despite not having a divine immunity to instant death. Martin asked him with a mocking grin if Sean really considered himself the main character in this story.